Thank you, Nestor. I'm very proud of you. Let me begin by forgiving you for what you did to my Dodgers last night. You know what Martin Luther King says about church could well be said about this prayer luncheon. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from, and you go from here to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. You go from here to dismantle the barriers that exclude. You go from here to stand at the margins, because if you stand at the margins get erased. You stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. You stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. You go from this place to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? And you go from here to stand at the margins, and you brace yourselves, because people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." And you go from this place to allow other voices to be heard. For 30 years, I worked with gang members, and it's the privilege of my life, and they've taught me everything of value. They've taught me humility and courage, and they've taught me what kind of God we have. Often enough, they do it through this kind of Yogi Berra mangling of the English language, which is very charming, but often illuminating. Like, I had a homegirl named Lisa, who was one of our trainees in our 18-month trainee program, and she came and she wanted to introduce her man to me, and she said, "This is my sufficient other." I said, "Well, no doubt." Fortunate for me, I've been running the program for 25 years, but last handful of years I've had a CEO who kind of runs Homeboy Industries. It's quite a large organization, so it's nice not to have to worry about the cash flow and the budget. And so I had a homie one day come into my office, and he said, "Damn, gee, my lady, she is in a bad mood today." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you know, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I've just ended mine, so kind of know what she's going through." But my favorite one happened when I was celebrating Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and there was a big gym, about 500 gang members, males, and they're all sitting on folding chairs, and I was vested, and I was sitting on my chair, and I had that little sheet they have that has the readings English and Spanish, and it was sitting on my lap, and I said, "Well, I'm going to listen to the word being proclaimed rather than read along." And a homie got up, and it was a psalm, I think, and with kind of an overabundance of confidence, he said, "The Lord is exhausted." And I looked at the sheet, what the hell? And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. You know, sometimes our God can get kind of puny. You know, the exalted God, frankly, is the God created in our own image. It's what I would want if I was God. But the exhausted God is probably closer to this expansive, spacious God, the God we're meant to imitate, the God who is unconditionally loving and kind, who asks us to go from this place and be in the world who God is. The exhausted God who's too busy loving us to have any time left for being disappointed. And so we want to imitate the kind of God we actually have, not the one we've settled for, not the partial God. It's a good tired, this exhausted God, who extends himself for the other, but especially the folks at the margins. You don't go to the margins to rescue anybody, but you go there and go figure, everybody gets rescued. You don't go to the margins to make a difference, but if you go there, the margins can make you different. And it's not about the distance in service sometimes, which is where we begin. Service is the hallway that gets you to the ballroom. You want to get to the ballroom, the place of connection. You want to get to that place where there is no daylight that separates us. There's just us. There is no us and them. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend, and I can remember once a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual." We want to go from here into the margins and try to experience this exquisite mutuality where there is no distance, service provider, service recipient. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth be told, we're all in need of healing. We're all a cry for help. It's one of the things that joins us together as members of the human family. In my 30-year history at Homeboy Industries, no homie found more job opportunities than this kid we all call Dreamer. I knew him since he was a little mocosito growing up in the housing projects. He got into a gang at 13, and a super smart kid, though I don't remember he ever went to school very much. He had a dangerous sense of humor that I always appreciated. He's in his 40s now, but in doing well, but in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo, in and out of being locked up. I'd find him a job in the private sector or in one of our 8 social enterprises, and before too long, he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. So it was a pattern that kept repeating itself. And so this one time he had finished a 4-month stretch in county jail, a probation violation, and he's sitting in front of my desk like a million times before, and he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." I said, all right. So with him sitting there, I called a friend of mine who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. He had hired homies in the past. I'm thinking maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, he does. He says, "You tell that guy he can start tomorrow." That's a holy man right there. So Dreamer began work the next day at the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is sitting in front of my desk. And I couldn't believe it. Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again. But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his very first paycheck and he waves it proudly and he says, "Damn, G, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, gosh, who?" And he looks at me strangely and he says, "Well, God, of course." I said, "Oh, sure, no. That's right, that would be God." He said, "You thought I was going to say you." I said, "No, gosh, God's number one. You are so lucky," he says, "that we're not living in them Genesis days." He goes, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now." Well, the only thing I really remember was that we fell out of our chairs howling with laughter, and I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider, who's the service recipient. It's mutual. All of us are called to live as though the truth were true and to go from this place and put first things recognizably first, living at the marrow of the gospel that can say, see how they love one another. There's nobody needy in this community. My favorite line from Acts of the Apostles is an odd one. It says, and awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of our health as a community may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. We go from here acknowledging that the principal suffering of the poor is shame and disgrace. And how can we go from here and choose to become enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves? Some years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and I said yes. And it was an all-day gang conference from 9 to 5. I figured, I'll do the keynote or speak at lunch or close the conference. And I didn't read the letter too well when I said yes. And with a week remaining before I was about to fly, I pulled the letter out, and to my horror, it was an all-day gang in service from 9 to 5. I was to be the only speaker for the entire day. So I called two homies, two trainees, Andre and Jose, into my office. I sat them down and I said, look, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose got up first, and he's 25 years old, and he was, a gang member, tattooed, been to prison. He was finishing up his 18 months at our place, had become a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. Now he was helping younger homies with their addiction issues. He had a long stretch of time as a homeless man, an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so he got up in front of 600 social workers and he said, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish, he said, And we went from gasp to laugh. We got whiplash. I think I was 9, he said, when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door. And a man comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid, and she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. And my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth be told, if we do not welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. It's mutual. Our kinship with each other is God's dream come true. It is the only praise God has any interest in, for it is the only thing that quenches God's thirst, that you may be one, that my joy may be yours, and your joy complete. Let me end with this. It occurs to people, universities mainly, to force their students to read my book against their will. I'm not complaining. But my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, forced their freshmen to read it one year, so they invited me and said, can you come and speak? And I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I do that often when people are going to pay for it. And I always pick homies in the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals who work at Homeboy together, just so force them, to share a hotel room together, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. Recently, I went to Washington, D.C., older guys, and one homie, dead serious at LAX airport, said, "Are we flying Virgin because it's our first time?" And I said, yes, I believe it's a requirement. So I picked 2 homies, Bobby, who worked in our Homeboy bakery, and Mario, who worked at the time in our Homeboy merchandise store. I've done this so many times, maybe 1,000 times. I don't know how many times. I've never picked anybody more terrified of flying than this guy, Mario. I mean, he was just absolutely petrified. He was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even gotten on the plane yet, and so we were flying out of Burbank Airport, which is a tiny little airport, and big bay windows, and Southwest Airlines mainly, and they don't have that hermetically sealed chute where you get on the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac, and like you're the president, and you're climbing up the steps that go to the front of the plane, and the steps that go to the back of a plane, which is a feature at Burbank, and so it's early morning, and our plane arrives, and people are getting off, and I turn to Mario sitting next to me. That's our plane, and I go, oh my God, he may die before we actually climb up those stairs. And so I watch our flight crew arrive, and there are 2 flight attendants, females, and they both have 2 large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the steps to get on the plane. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that Mario, in my 30-year history with this organization, is the most tattooed individual who has ever worked at Homeboy. He's all sleeved out and neck blackened with the name of his gang, and head shaved, covered with tattoos, and forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids, And I had never been in public with him, and so we were walking in Burbank Airport, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy on Monday and ask anybody there, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here, they won't say me. They'll say, yeah, Mario. And he works now behind the counter selling baked goods. Yeah, he's the most kind, gentle soul here. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing that world. So we get to Gonzaga, and this always happens, where they have the big talk Tuesday night, but what they don't tell you is that they have 93 other talks planned, and this class, this lunch, this meeting, this class, all day long. So I tell Bobby and Mario, I'm not going to speak at any of these. I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. You get up and you tell your stories. And they were nervous, especially Mario, but they did a good job. Stories of terror and torture and abuse of every imaginable kind. Honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I wouldn't have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So the nighttime talk came. It was huge. It was a venue like this, and it was, I tell Mario and Bobby, I said, look, I want you to get up just before me and do a little 5-minute, 7-minute, tell your story so that I can include you with me during the question and answer period. And they were terrified, especially Mario, but they did a good job. Then I got up and did my thing, and then I just opened it up. Yes, ma'am. And a woman stands and she goes, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out of the gates for Mario. And so he's a tall drink of water, and he's standing in front of the microphone. He's clutching it and he's trembling. Yes. And he's just terrified at whatever this woman's going to ask him. And she says, well, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone, and I can feel the heat of his own emotion about to overwhelm him completely. And he's trembling, and he's getting a damn hernia trying to come up with something to say. But he wants to get this sentence out when suddenly he blurts, And as soon as he says that, he catches himself and he returns to this microphone clutching, closed-eyed retreat, and he's trembling all the more. And boy, it feels like he's going to lose this battle with his own emotions, but he wants to get this sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands again. Now it's her turn to cry. And she looks at Mario and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And they, in turn, also returned. Because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise God has any interest in. That you may be one, that my joy may be yours, and your joy complete. This luncheon is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. It is God's dream. It is the only thing that can quench God's thirst. And pretty soon you cease to care whether anyone accuses you of wasting your time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. We go from here and allow other voices to be heard. And as you go from here, may God bless you. Thank you very much.